that today is World Refugee Day. So every year the 20th of June is World Refugee Day, which encourages people to stand together with refugees. And we always do a book display of material relating to the refugee experience. If people were in the library earlier in the year, they may have seen a silent book exhibition, which was an exhibition of picture books, wordless picture books, that started in Switzerland, had travelled throughout Europe, and were going to ultimately end up in Greece, working with refugees, and the idea was that you were using wordless books. So with that idea, this is actually a poster for World Refugee Day showing two Syrian brothers outside the newly built library at Philippada camp on the Greek mainland. And this is where some of our books will have ended up ultimately. But for the World Refugee Day, we decided it would be interesting as part of our cultural programming to perhaps have a guest speaker to talk about a refugee experience. And we were very happy that Yanky Fachler agreed to come along this evening and talk on World Refugee Day. Yanky is chair of the Jewish Historical Society of Ireland. He's written a number of publications on the Jewish experience, both in Ireland and abroad. He has lived in Ireland for nearly 20 years. His field is Jewish history, both modern and not so modern. And so he is a very interesting speaker, an interesting person to have here this evening. He has also brought some of his material and books along for sale. They're all approximately €10. So this talk fits into really our idea around raising awareness and part of our cultural programming. So if I could ask people please to listen and to hold back any questions or comments until the end, and we will allow some time at the end for questions and comments. All right, I can hand you over the floor. Thank you.
Thank you everybody for turning up. And I'm really very grateful to the library for the invitation to come and speak. And my talk is called, at the request of the World Refugee Day organization, The Jewish Refugee Experience During World War II. I think it would be true to say that I come from a long line of refugees. Before World War I, my mother's grandparents were refugees from Lithuania to Germany. Before World War II, my mother's grandparents were refugees from Germany to Palestina, as it was called then, the British Mandate in what would later become the State of Israel. Immediately before World War II, both my mum and her parents were refugees from Germany to England. Immediately before World War II, my dad was a refugee from Germany to England. Other family members were refugees from Germany to Belgium, from Germany to Shanghai, and from Poland to Russia. In fact, I may well be the first generation in my family for 100 years who was never a refugee. Now, it is true that I have moved country twice, first from England to Israel, and then from Israel to Ireland. And the reason that I moved to Ireland is sitting in front of me here, Mona. But I moved out of free choice. And that, of course, is the distinguishing factor when it comes to refugees. I was not persecuted. I did not have to escape. But although I've never been a refugee, I'm very much a product of the refugee experience. I am what is known as a second-generation Holocaust survivor. That is, I am the son of parents who both escaped the Holocaust that wiped out 6 million of my fellow Jews. As a child, everyone I knew, literally, was a refugee, which partly explains my slightly odd English accent, which wherever I speak in the world, bets are taken as to where I'm actually from. So someone is nodding in the front row who's already realized that. And the reason is, in my formative years, the only language I spoke and heard was English, but it was English with a German accent and a Yiddish accent and a French accent and a Czech accent and a Hungarian accent and a Russian accent and a Polish accent. So by the time I was 5, it was too late. And funnily enough, none of my siblings, and I have several, were afflicted with the same affliction. This evening I've been invited to mark World Refugee Day by talking about the Jewish refugee experience during World War II. And I will do this by telling my family's story. To understand the scale of the pre-World War II Jewish refugee experience, we must go back to January 1933, when a bunch of incredibly naive German politicians believed that they could control Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party by making him Chancellor. Overnight, state-sponsored terrorism became the norm, and the brunt of Nazi policies was directed against the Jews. The Nazis declared a boycott of Jewish-owned businesses. My 9-year-old father watched in horror from his Berlin apartment as SA men in their brown uniforms came with tins of white paint and daubed anti-Jewish slogans on the windows of Jewish-owned shops. And in that particular area, there were lots of Jewish-owned shops. Some German Jews were quick to grasp the danger of the Nazi reign of terror. One of the first to react was a gentleman in Frankfurt with a name that will definitely be familiar to all of you, Otto Frank, the father of Anne Frank. In August 1933, he fled Germany with his wife and 2 daughters and opened a business in Amsterdam, Holland. Many members of my mum's family in Germany also saw the writing on the wall in the early 1930s, and my mum's grandfather and many of her uncles, aunts and cousins fled Germany and became refugees in the British Mandatory Authority of Palestine, that is, pre-state Israel. Life for Jews as the 30s progressed became increasingly dangerous. The notorious Nuremberg laws were passed, depriving Jews of their citizenship, banning them from many professions, and confiscating their property. And the terror got worse as each year passed. All of a sudden, Jews realized that the very police that should have protected them were the main instruments of persecuting them. All of a sudden, it was dangerous to speak to strangers. All of a sudden, you could no longer take for granted that basic human right, personal freedom. And my late dad said to me many times, anyone born in a free country cannot begin to imagine what it is like to live under a totalitarian regime. As the anti-Jewish agitation grew, so did the urgency for Jews to leave Germany. But what many people do not realize is that in the early years of the Nazi regime, Jews were allowed to leave Germany. The problem was that these Jews couldn't find anywhere to go. No one would take them in. After Germany annexed Austria, March 1938, the Anschluss, US President Roosevelt tried to solve the problem by calling an international conference to deal with the emigration of Austrian and German Jewish refugees. Delegates from 32 countries, including Ireland, attended the conference in Evian, like the bottled water, same Evian. The conference was a total farce. Country after country, including Ireland, made it clear that while they appreciated the problem, they were not prepared to open their doors. Maybe we should not be surprised at Ireland's attitude, because Ireland's representative in Berlin, Charles Bewley, was an out-and-out Nazi sympathizer who approved of everything that the Germans were doing against the Jews. Bewley personally saw to it that barely a handful of Jews were given visas to come to Ireland. Irish Jews like Robert Briscoe, a TD, friend of de Valera and later Lord Mayor of Dublin, tried valiantly before and during the war to get Ireland to take in Jewish refugees. But despite assuring the Briscoes that they were doing everything to help, Irish officials and Irish politicians made every effort to ensure that practically no Jews were allowed in. And as Briscoe's son Joe said on many occasions, he was glad his father never lived to discover that the Irish state had consistently lied to the Jewish community before, during, and after the Holocaust. At least two ministers of justice, Irish ministers of justice, have publicly stated that Ireland is guilty of sins of omission and commission when it comes to their treatment of Jewish refugees before and during and after World War II. Back to the Evian Refugee Conference. No one was willing to take in Jewish refugees. One country, the Dominican Republic, tiny country in the West Indies, volunteered to take in refugees in exchange for humongous sums of money. The world's democracies, including Ireland, made it clear that someone else, not them, had to solve the Jewish refugee problem. Hitler was quick to poke fun at the Evian participants. He told the Reichstag, "We're happy to let our Jews leave, but no one wants them." And he was right. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, I would not be here today if both my parents had not somehow managed to reach Britain as teenage refugees from Nazi Germany before World War II. How did they manage it? And that's the story I want to tell you this evening. Start with my mum. Like Anne Frank, the famous diarist, my mum was born during the 1920s in Frankfurt, Germany. Like Anne Frank's family, my mum's family also decided that it was time to leave when anti-Jewish policies reached a peak. Like Anne Frank, my mum escaped to Amsterdam. But here, sadly, the similarity between Anne Frank and my mum ends. As refugees in Holland, the Frank family was safe only while Holland remained neutral and independent. But as soon as the Nazis invaded Holland in 1940, their status, the status of the Frank family, became precarious. Otto Frank had tried to get visas to America but was unsuccessful, and as nearly everybody knows, the Frank family hid in the famous annex in Amsterdam, which is where Anne Frank wrote her diary. They were arrested by Dutch police, not by German soldiers, by Dutch police, and sent to Auschwitz in Poland. Anne Frank was sent to Bergen-Belsen and did not survive. Happily, the story of the other Frankfurt-born girl, my mum, was very different. By a freak of history, and the details are, there's more detail on this freak of history in the book I wrote about my parents, which is called The Vow, Rebuilding a Jewish Tribe After the Holocaust, and it's based on the journals of two young refugees from Nazi Germany, my mum and my dad. By this freak of history, my mum, who is 95, and I've just spent a week with her in her home in Jerusalem, she had South African nationality. And in those days, South African nationality meant you were a British subject. And when she was born, my grandfather registered her as a South African subject in the British consulate in Hamburg. So when the family decided in 1938 it was time to leave Nazi Germany, they were able practically to waltz out of the country because they had somewhere to go. Pretending to be going on holiday in Holland, they took with them buckets and spades so as not to arouse any suspicions. My mum and her mum and sister stayed with friends in Holland for a month. I visited these friends a few years ago in Australia, while my mum's dad, my granddad, went to London to find them accommodation. So for a month in 1938, Frankfurt-born Anne Frank and Frankfurt-born Eva Becker both lived in Amsterdam at the same time. As soon as my grandfather found a place for the family to live in London, the women joined him. The Becker family became refugees in England. My dad's experience was very, very different. He too was born in Germany, but his nationality was Polish. His parents were Polish Jews who'd moved to Germany at the end of World War I. As the Nazi menace grew in Germany during the 30s, my dad's family was stuck. Even if they wanted to leave, where could they go? And the last place they wanted to go was their native Poland, because the Polish government hated its Jews as much, if not worse, than the Nazis. A very uncomfortable truth. So vicious was Polish anti-Jewish sentiment that in 1938 the Polish government published a decree designed to make sure that the thousands of Polish Jews in Germany, we're talking about Polish citizens, could not return to Poland. My grandparents were in that category. The Nazi authorities in Germany were so incensed at this Polish decree because they didn't want to be stuck with these Polish Jews. So in the middle of the night on the 28th of October 1938, the Gestapo arrested thousands of Polish Jews across Germany in order to deport them to Poland. But when the German soldiers tried to dump these Polish Jews across the German-Polish border, Polish soldiers brandishing bayonets stopped them. The Poles refused to let their own citizens in. During this standoff, thousands of Polish Jews were stuck in the middle between the two countries in a no man's land on the German-Polish border in the middle of winter. One of those Polish Jews was my granddad. My dad himself was unbelievably lucky. The Gestapo raids took place one day after his 15th birthday. Had they come a day later, his name would have been on the list. My grandmother was so frightened that she sent my dad to hide with family. She must have been terrified. Her husband had been carted off. She was worried about her children, Ellie, my dad, aged 15, and Miriam, my aunt, aged 11. And things were about to get much worse. One of the families stuck in no man's land with my grandfather was the Greenspan family. The daughter wrote to her brother in Paris about what had happened. He went out in Paris, bought a gun, and assassinated the third secretary at the German embassy in Paris. The Nazis retaliated with a well-planned, state-sponsored pogrom known to the world as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. hundreds of synagogues burnt to the ground, over 100 Jews murdered, thousands of Jewish shops and communal institutions destroyed, and over 30,000 Jews taken to concentration camps, all in one night. The only positive result of this pogrom, Kristallnacht, is that in Britain, public opinion suddenly woke up. You may notice that I say in Britain, not in America, not in Ireland, just in Britain. The British government agreed to give emergency temporary refuge to 10,000 unaccompanied Jewish child refugees from German-occupied Europe. Their instincts were not that great that they allowed any parents to come, but 10,000 children did arrive in Britain. And luckily, both my dad and his sister were chosen to join what is known as the Kindertransports, the child transports. In recent years, the Kindertransports received much publicity when the exploits of British stockbroker Nicholas Winton, Sir Nicholas Winton, came to light. He personally organised 700 children personally to escape from Prague in what was then Czechoslovakia on the Kindertransport. On the afternoon of May the 19th, 1939, my dad left Berlin's Anhalter Bahnhof railway station on his Kindertransport train. Waving him goodbye were his dad, who had just been released from the no man's land between Poland and Germany after 6 months, his mum, his 11-year-old sister, whose papers hadn't come through yet, so my dad was leaving alone. And although my dad didn't know it at the time, he would never see his parents again. His parents, and all the parents, gathered at the station surely had few illusions. One can only imagine the anguish of my grandparents as they sent their only son to safety. They must have suspected that they would never see him again. My dad was delighted to discover dozens of his friends on the train. They crossed the border to Holland after some tense searches by the Gestapo. They took the ferry to Britain. My dad arrived in London's Liverpool Street Station on the 20th of May 1939, and if ever any of you visit Liverpool Street Station, there's a very moving statue there that commemorates the arrival of the Kindertransport children. And if you see it, you'll understand this is how they all arrived. The boys in shorts, the girls in dresses, and each one of them carrying a little case. My dad was sent to a farm school in Scotland, where he spent the next 2 years. My dad's sister Miriam managed to get out on almost the last Kindertransport before World War II broke out in September 1939. So during the 1930s, thousands of Jewish adults, in addition to the 10,000 children on the Kindertransport, had become refugees in Britain. In the earlier 30s, it was much easier to get into Britain. It got progressively more difficult. These Jewish refugees were very relieved to be in a free country that showed the determination to stand up to the hated Nazis. They were even more relieved in 1940 when Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. But things changed very rapidly when France fell in 1940. Fearing a Nazi invasion, the British government suspected that fifth-column Germans in Britain might try and undermine British resolve. In a draconian move, Churchill's wartime government decided to intern every German national in Britain, and every Italian as well, by the way. The expression used was, collar the lot. And as a result, thousands of Jewish refugees to Britain were interned, with the British authorities making no distinction between anti-Nazi Jews and pro-Nazi Germans, bunged them all in together. You can imagine what it must have been like to be a German Jew who had fled the detested Nazis, who had sought refuge in Britain, only to be arrested in Britain under suspicion of being pro-Nazi. I mean, it doesn't get more weird than that. And can you imagine what it was like to be in an internment camp together with real pro-Nazis who believed that you were Jewish scum? I have met people, several, who were interned on the Isle of Man and who were shipped aboard internment ships, vessels, to Canada and to Australia. And that's a whole area of history about which many books have been written. My dad vividly remembers the day that the police arrived and arrested dozens of his fellow students and nearly all the teachers. Just to give you an idea of how absurd the situation was, I want to tell you a story about a guy called John, who was, like my dad, came over as a young man as a teenager, from Germany to Britain as a refugee on the kinder transport. And John told me his story many years ago. He was at school when he was interned, like so many others, sent to the Isle of Man. And at a certain point on the Isle of Man, because all the men were off fighting, the authorities agreed to allow some of the Jewish internees to go and work in the fields. So John was minding his own business with a spade, digging up potatoes in a field above Douglas, if anyone knows the Isle of Man. Suddenly, 2 military policemen turn up, put handcuffs on John, and march him down the hill to Douglas, where in Douglas to the British Army Recruitment Office, where they took off his handcuffs. John was given a Bible, he swore allegiance to King George, and walked out the building a British soldier. As they say here, not the word of a lie. My dad escaped internment because he was a Polish citizen. And Polish citizens were known by this strange expression. They were friendly aliens. The Poles were called friendly aliens. Alien, yes, but a friendly alien, because Poland, of course, was an ally of Britain in the war. There was an immediate outcry, of course, against internment of Hitler's most implacable enemies, German Jews. Took a while for the British government to cop on. Eventually, all German Jews were released, but for some it was too late because they'd already been shipped off to Australia or Canada. Meanwhile, my dad completed his time on his Scottish farm school. And I've recently come across, my father died 2 years ago, and I've been going through his papers, and I found his aliens registration document was endorsed on the 10th of July 1941 as follows: permission is given for Holder to commence work for Bucks, that's Buckinghamshire, War Agricultural Committee at Lodge Farm, Hardmead, Bucks. Now this might sound strange. Hardmead in Buckinghamshire was a kibbutz. If you thought that kibbutzim could only be in Israel, no. During World War II, because agricultural work was so important to the country, if you weren't in the army, you had to work on the land. And the British government didn't care if young Jews who worked on the land to fulfill their Ministry of Agriculture obligations, if they pretended to be on a kibbutz. Didn't bother anyone. And so these they were organized entirely on kibbutz lines, in the same way that kibbutzim in Israel were being organized and continue to be later. They were collective, they were communal. So when my dad first arrived in Scotland, in his farm school, he kept up a lively correspondence with his parents. This was still just before World War II. So there was correspondence between Britain and Poland. And in the meantime, his parents had been forced to go back to Poland under an agreement between the German and the Polish governments. The Nazi invasion of Poland, September 1939, which of course marked the outbreak of World War II, meant that all correspondence between Scotland and Poland was now out of the question. My dad found a way round that. He routed his letters via neutral Belgium, where close cousins who had run away from Berlin to Belgium before the war, they were already living in Belgium. My dad kept every letter he received during the period between May 1939 and June 1940. They're letters you would expect from concerned parents. Why don't you write more? Are you eating okay? Are you in touch with your sister? Did you remember to send birthday greetings to your aunt? But the letters also showed the sense of doom that the Jews of Poland were experiencing. Here's a letter that my grandfather wrote to his son 1 week before Germany invaded Poland, and listen to the almost biblical tone of the letter. And I've reproduced this also on the back page, on the back cover of the book. I quote, "The troubled situation is affecting everything and everyone. No one knows what will happen here. We thank the Almighty that you are not here now. May the Lord look after you and hold his right hand over you to protect you." That's just biblical. When Belgium was overrun by the Germans in 1940, of course all correspondence now ceased. There was no neutral territory through which my father could route letters to his parents. And for the next 2 years, there were sporadic Red Cross telegrams, each telegram maximum 25 words, and you weren't allowed to say anything, either side, either direction, that could be construed as criticizing anything or anyone. So the telegrams normally were, "Dear Mum and Dad, I'm very well, how are you, how is the family, looking forward to hearing from you." And the same mundane message coming back. After 1942, a black hole. And to this day, we know no details of where, when, or how my dad's family, his parents, his grandparents, uncles, aunts and cousins perished at the hands of the Nazi murderers and their willing accomplices throughout Europe. So at the age of 19, except for his younger sister, my refugee dad was alone. I mentioned that he was considered a friendly alien because he had Polish nationality. And because he had Polish nationality, the Polish army in exile, based in Britain, tried to call my dad up. He point blank refused. There was no way he was going to be part of an anti-Semitic army, of an anti-Semitic nation, even if they were allies of Britain. And he'd heard stories of how Jews in the Polish army in Britain were being discriminated against. My dad was not the only Polish Jew to refuse to fight for the Polish army in exile, and the British government allowed these Polish Jews to join the British army instead. So my dad became a British soldier in 1944 and stayed in uniform until 1947. Back to my mum. Her family's experience was very different. I said that most of her family had moved to Palestine in the 30s. One of her aunts managed to escape with her husband from Germany via Russia and Siberia to Shanghai in China, which was under Japanese control. And together with thousands of other Jews, they survived the war years. As soon as my mum's family arrived in London, remember they came in 1938, they joined the synagogue of Dr. Rabbi Solomon Schonfeld, an unsung Holocaust hero who single-handedly rescued thousands of Jews from Europe. He was also the headmaster of the Jewish secondary school where my mum's sister Marion was a pupil. The 500 pupils, mostly refugee children, were evacuated to a place called Shefford in Hertfordshire in September 1939, in parentheses along with 1 million other school children from London who were evacuated out of the city. My mum accompanied her sister, and when the Blitz started, the bombing, in 1940, my grandparents also came out to live in the country. They soon discovered the Jewish community in a place called Letchworth Garden City, and they moved there in Hertfordshire. Letchworth was full of Jewish refugees. In a BBC project, Bill Richards wrote, "We had Mr. and Mrs. Hackenbroch from London compulsory billeted on us for about 18 months. They were a pleasant Orthodox Jewish couple, both practicing dentists, refugees from Germany. They travelled to London daily." Now my mum, who I've just been visiting in Jerusalem, my 95-year-old mum, out of the blue, 2 days ago, said to me, "You know that we had a dentist called Hackenbroch?" I said, "Yeah, I'd worked that out." And earlier this year, I delivered a talk in Letchworth on the sizable Jewish community that flourished there during the war. Now, I mentioned that my dad got onto this tiny little kibbutz called Hardmead. So in the meantime, my refugee mum, she'd become a land girl. And it was on that tiny, minuscule kibbutz in a field in Buckingham that my mum meets my dad. In December 1944, with my dad already in army uniform, they were married on their kibbutz. And as they stood under the wedding canopy with German doodlebug rockets in the sky above, my dad knew that he probably lost his entire family. My refugee parents made a vow, that's why I've called my book The Vow, to create a new tribe out of the ashes of the Holocaust. Born prematurely in Letchworth exactly 8 months after VE Day, Victory Day in Europe, I was the first member of this new tribe. Since then, I think it's safe to say that my parents have fulfilled their vow with a vengeance. At the last count, the tribe they established included 7 children, 26 grandchildren, and 105 great-grandchildren. 2 born in the last 2 weeks. And with the very first great-grandchild getting married in August, I reckon if my mum hangs in there, this time next year, she could be a great-great-granny. Some fulfillment of a vow. Although my dad lost practically his whole family, a handful of relatives did survive the Holocaust. I mentioned the family in Belgium that had been the conduit for the correspondence between my dad in Scotland and his parents in Poland before Belgium was overrun. The aunt was called Judith. When Belgium was liberated by the British in 1945, she came out of hiding and went up to a British soldier walking down the street because she noticed he had a Star of David emblem on his British Army uniform, because he was a member of a unit called the Jewish Brigade, part of the British Army. She went up to him and asked in Yiddish, as you do, "Do you know Yanky Fachler?" I'd hardly be telling you the story if he turned round and said, "Never heard of him." Not only did he know my dad, he knew exactly where my dad was stationed. And he sent word back through army channels, and very, very quickly the army gave my dad compassionate leave to visit Belgium in his army uniform to meet up with his surviving family. From an early age, I would take the ferry with my dad from Dover to Ostend every year to visit these last remnants of the family. In a family that has been decimated, you tend to cling to those who are left, however distant the relationship. I'm very close with this Judith's nephew. Saturday night was his 70th birthday. We're probably 5th or 6th cousins, but it feels like he's a brother. I think I worked out over the weekend that we share a great-great-grandfather. That's as close as we are. Other survivors of the family could have saved themselves the bother of surviving. 2 of my father's cousins somehow survived Nazi concentration camps. And after spending several months in the displaced persons camps in Europe after the war, they made the tragic mistake of returning to their native Poland. Now we're talking about after the war, after the whole world knows that 6 million Jews were murdered, and the 2 brothers arrived back in their hometown of Kielce, where they were murdered by their good Catholic neighbors. 15 months after the Holocaust, on Polish soil, over 40 Jews were murdered that day in the Kielce pogrom, not by the Nazis, but by the Poles. One other member of my dad's family survived the Holocaust, my father's uncle Yukul, and he survived, strangely enough, because he was a communist. And as a communist, He knew to flee in time from Poland to Russia in 1939 when the Germans invaded. He joined the Red Army, returned to Poland, and although Poland after the war had almost no Jews left, old habits die hard and virulent anti-Semitism once again gripped Poland in 1956 in the aftermath of the Poznan riots, which brought in the Gomulka regime. Once again in the history of my family, anti-Semitism turned my family into refugees. I still remember as a very young child hearing my dad yelling into a phone at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning in a language I didn't understand. "Daddy," I said, "who are you talking to? What language are you speaking? And why at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning?" He was talking, of course, to his uncle Jukul in Poland. The language was Yiddish. And why 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning? Because everybody in Poland and outside Poland knew that the only time of the week you could speak freely on the phone to this Iron Curtain country was Sunday morning. Why? Because the official interpreters were all drunk from Saturday night. My father helped obtain visas for his uncle to get to Australia. In 1959, my dad travelled to Genoa, where he met his family prior to their sailing to Melbourne as refugees to Australia. My dad had borrowed £100, which he gave to his uncle to help them start their new lives as refugees in Australia. When I first met Jukul's son, 40 years later, the very first thing he did was to take out his wallet and whip out that same £100 note. They'd never spent the money, but they'd used it as collateral to raise funds for setting themselves up in Australia. And I'm just back from visiting Uncle Jukul's great-grandchildren in Melbourne. Like I say, when a family is decimated, you cling to the very few that survive, no matter how far the relationship, the distance. Ladies and gentlemen, today I've traced the story of Jewish refugees desperately trying to escape the Nazis. And today, as we mark World Refugee Day, when you say refugees, our thoughts immediately go primarily to Syrian refugees. In 1938, as I mentioned, the British government took in my parents, 38 and 39, took in my parents as refugees from Germany. At the height of the current Syrian refugee crisis, the British government offered to take in a small number of child refugees. In the House of Lords, Lord Alf Dubs forced the British government to increase the number of lone asylum seekers under the age of 50. Why was Lord Dubs so bothered about the Syrian child refugees? Because just like my dad, Alfred Dubs arrived in Britain in 1939 as a child refugee on the Kinder transport. I won't go into what's happened since politically, that all the things that he demanded and the British government agreed to, they have since rowed back on. Where is Ireland in all of this? As part of the 2015 Irish Refugee Protection Programme, the Irish government, you may remember, made a commitment to allow 4,000 refugees from Syria and Eritrea into Ireland by December 2017. By December 2016, fewer than 20% of the 4,000 refugees had arrived. No wonder the Children's Rights Alliance, Ireland's leading children's rights NGO, in its 2017 report card has given the Irish government a D- score for its delivery on its commitments to refugees. Surely, with our history of millions of Irish people finding refuge in America and elsewhere, Ireland should be at the forefront of humanitarian and generous-spirited hosting of refugees. Surely, with our history of not responding adequately in the past to global refugee crises, we should have learned to be more welcoming. Thank you.